Let's discuss some alternative methods to dealing with inflation without raising interest rates. Inflation. The dirty word of 2022 appears to have left a mess for 2023. With each interest rate increase, pressure is added to the household budget, and for some, there's nothing left to give. Isn't it time inflation pressures got eased in another method besides interest rate rises? Let's discuss an alternative method to dealing with inflation in 2023. To understand if it's possible to get creative with inflation, we need to look at the major drivers of inflation. The biggest inflation increase on an annual basis from the latest quarterly CPI are found in food, housing, furnishings, transport, and recreation. The focus of this is going to be on food and transport. Housing will be covered separately. The rest are generally considered non-essential, so they can be ignored. You would have had to been living under a rock not to notice the fuel price increases or the increases to groceries over the last year. Long is gone the days of $1 a litre petrol, but maybe there are a few ways to get back to affordable food and fuel. Australia differs from most advanced economies. Not only is the content resource rich, it is also a net exporter of food, characteristics generally associated with developing economies. The nation is a net exporter of food, and in 2018-2019, Australia exported an estimated $49 billion from the agricultural sector. This was around 70% of the total agricultural production. The country has a plentiful supply of food, a game-changing advantage in times of high inflation. Australia's pristine resources also continue underground. It's no secret that Australia seems to have some of the most valuable natural resources in the world. From gold to coal, Australia exports most of its mined resources each year. In 2021, Australia exported 593 petajoules and imported 547 petajoules of oil, essentially a neutral position. Australia lacks a domestic capacity to refine oil and therefore ships it overseas to have it refined and then re-imports the refined product. Two of the most common known byproducts of crude oil is petrol and diesel, and these form a large proportion of the transportation costs. The graph is a good representation of Australia's energy exports. The information that has been discussed is important to understand when considering ways to help combat inflation, as two of the most leading drivers of inflation are transport and food prices. Helping solve these price rises will have a greater impact, especially because transport is a component of almost every other part of inflation. If fighting inflation is the priority of the government, they need to step in and set a price ceiling for food, considering the fact that Australia exports 70% of its agricultural products overseas. If producers, in this case farmers, can achieve better prices on international markets, should they not take those prices? As a result, the domestic market pays closer to the global market for prices of goods than it would otherwise, because there would be no incentive for farmers, or producers in this case, to supply the local market. Setting price controls for the agricultural sector can be achieved in a few ways. For example, directly setting a price ceiling for all prices in the domestic market, with a ban on exports till the domestic market is filled below the ceiling price. Without the capacity to refine oil, Australia lacks the ability to be self-sufficient from the rest of the world. If there were a domestic capacity, world prices for oil could largely be ignored, with a price ceiling like that discussed for the agricultural sector. Instead, the government should place a price ceiling on the pump price with a subsidy to either the importer or the retailer. This shouldn't be some half effort either. It needs to lead to substantially lower fuel prices. For example, petrol back at $1.20 a litre on average. Australia in October of 2022 consumed 5.175 billion litres of petrol including diesel. Factor in an average subsidy of around 36 cents a litre and remove the entire fuel excise tax of 44.2 cents a litre and watch the impact this has on transportation costs. Critics of this plan will say that it's going to cost the government north of $4 billion per month, and that's unaffordable. This is around half of what was spent on COVID in 2021, and inflation itself is a war. Australia can help offset the fuel subsidy through a mining tax on iron ore exports, with almost 900 million tonnes of iron ore exported every year. Australia is the largest single producer, being 37% of the market. Iron ore is currently around $111 US per tonne. Place a 15% tax on the market price for Australian iron ore, and the government would generate around 19 billion Australian in revenue, around 40% of the total fuel offset costs. Australia's debt to GDP ratio is low enough that even without the tax, the country could justify the subsidy. With a debt to GDP of 56% compared with the UK at 87% and the US at 127%, there is plenty of room to expand the level of debt. If a measure like this helps decrease the chances for a recession, it's money very well spent, because the government will spend significantly more in a major economic downturn. With predictions of a global slowdown in mid-2023, prices should fall shortly after. Therefore, these measures will probably only need to be in place for 1 to 2 years. While the solutions that have been discussed are very unconventional, the world is in an unconventional period. The government has already taken a very contractionary stance on monetary policy, and it doesn't have much room left unless they are willing to accept a major recession, if not depression. It's time that Australia regulates its way out of inflation. Those against these suggestions will state that they are an abandonment of free trade and neoclassical economics. But they should not forget inflation is a war, and it's every country for itself.